So once again, thank you both for joining us today. We really appreciate it for the Engaging Men's campaign. Um, I guess we'll just get started off a little bit about if you can both just discuss a little bit about the intersection of sports and culture and what inspired you both not only to write about that topic, and Kavitha, congrats on the new position with the Athletic, but also the idea behind the book, Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back.
Um, well, I mean, I've kind of always written about the intersection of sports and culture. My first professional sports writing job was at Bloomberg, and as you can imagine, at Bloomberg, a lot of it was business focus. I was a sports business financial journalist, but a lot of it also was kind of using business and using the lens of sports to um, explore broader things. And that really, I trace that back to a class that I took between my freshman and sophomore years at Columbia. And it was a graduate school class that I had to petition to take, but it was called The Socio-Historical Foundations of American Sport. And it was all about how the history of America coincided with the history of sport and how, certain developments in our country, the specialization of labor during the Industrial Revolution, coincided with similar phenomenons in sports. So specialization in baseball happened at that time. So I really saw how these two worlds were intertwined from the time I was 18 years old. And I've always kind of viewed sports as a way to examine things in broader society. So, I did that at Bloomberg, and related to, what we're talking about today, when the Ray Rice video hit, it was an opportunity to look at, our attitudes about domestic violence and how just as a society we view it, how it goes reported or unreported, and how the kinds of questions that people ask. And I remember very vividly, I wrote a column about, because right after that, everyone basically questioned Janae Rice about why she still married Ray. And basically I wrote a column that was like, this is the wrong question to be asking. And then I explained how battered women syndrome works and explained that, I can't say whether or not she has that, but that there are lots of reasons that a woman might go back to a person who has abused them in the past. So, and I remember getting emails from people, mostly Bloomberg terminal subscribers who just wanted to read about sports. A lot of them were mad that I was writing about this, and that was to be expected. But I did get emails from people who were like, I didn't expect to like this, and I didn't expect to learn something from this, but I did. And so sports was a way to teach people about things like this. And I think that, Jessica and I can probably tell you, Jessica can probably go into how we came up for the idea with the book, but I mean, or maybe not. So we think it was around the time that the Super Bowl happens. And every year there's always these like really condescending pieces that are very clearly geared toward women and that are very clearly geared toward women not like Jessica or me, women who are presumed not to know anything about sports. And they're always something like, how to survive a Super Bowl party, or how to talk to your boyfriend about football. And it's always, very, very basic football terms, and then like a recipe for dip. And we were just like, well, first of all, we hate this. This happens every year. Second of all, none of these pieces are written for us. And that's so much of media, is so much of sports media is not written for women who love sports. And we were like, what if we were mostly snarky, to be honest. We were like, what if we wrote completely the opposite of this? What if we wrote, how to talk to your boyfriend about, or how to deal with your boyfriend about football when he knows nothing about it, and like that kind of thing, just like the snarky rejoinder. And it ended up getting massaged into this obviously very different, very much more serious project, by our publisher and editor, Casey, at the University of Texas Press. But that was kind of the idea going in, was that so much of sports media, and definitely sports publishing, doesn't cater to us. And we wanted to talk to fans like us, and, like people that we know who do have these moral dilemmas, even though they love sports.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good way to think about why I always associate sports and culture. I think when you're on the outside of a group that you want to be on the inside of, you're like hyper aware of the context and the culture that's around it, that's creating this exclusion and inclusion, and your place in it. I understand if you're in it, that maybe you don't feel all of that, you don't see it as much. But I do think Kavitha pointing to Ray Rice as a good example. I think one thing about sports is people really do love it and identify very hard with it. And so when something comes into the conversation, people will have to have it in that space, whether or not they want to necessarily. And so you do have avenues to explore bigger things in culture as they intersect with sports, right? So whether or not that's gendered violence or issues around labor, like we talk about labor so much. And I mean, right now we're having like a moment about that, but we're way more likely to talk about a union when it involves athletes than we are basically anywhere else in society, because it interferes with the sports that we want to watch, right? And so it just becomes I think it's just a super useful vehicle for understanding culture at large. And I think nothing showed us this better than last year, that sports also has a huge impact on our culture itself. Like, I think most people started to take COVID much more seriously the day that Rudy Gobert got COVID and the NBA shut down. Like, we saw that had such a massive impact on all of us, whether or not you played or cared about basketball, right? And so it goes both ways a lot of the time. And so it just is such a fruitful intersection. And I think that's one thing that was really fun about the book, is like each chapter is a different issue within sport that a conscientious sports fan might care about. But one thing I love about the book is that you see it all together, right? So each chapter could be its own book. There are books written about the topics that we chose to write about, but there is something about seeing all of these issues together in the same space. So you're like, oh yeah, sports and culture, culture and sports, these just live together all the time.
And one of those chapters in that book has to do with domestic violence and rooting for your favorite team when the star player was accused of domestic violence. Some of the players mentioned in the book were Roldis Chapman, Jose Reyes, Greg Hardy. How can fans hold the players in the team accountable for their actions while still being a fan of that team?
I mean, I don't know if they can, is the unfortunate answer to that. And I think that, we get at that in that chapter, we get at that in the book. Most of the strategies that the fans that we talked to, stated and talked about were how they personally navigated this, right? None of those strategies affected actual change from the part of the team. Like, all of those players were still employed. Greg Hardy, until like the fourth thing that he did, basically.
He was like mean to his teammates.
Well, he he punched a coach on the side.
Yeah, I would just say, like, he had to do something internal to the team.
Yeah. Like every single one of the things that Greg Hardy had done should have been a fireable offense. So, but anyway, I do think that there is something to be said for when fans collectively express disdain for a player who has been accused of something, or collectively do say that this was not okay. We can't root for this player, even if we still root for this team. I don't know. We haven't seen any evidence of that really yet, frankly, but we are starting to see what public pressure can do when it comes to especially sexual harassment, right? Like the Jared Porter and Mickey Callaway stuff that my colleagues Britt Garoli and Katie Strang have been reporting on at The Athletic. I don't know if without public outcry and without continued exposure, anything really gets done there. Jared Porter is likely still employed if people don't talk about that, if fans don't express that they care about that. Now, Sandy Alderson is still employed, so that obviously does have limits. But the strategies that we talked about in the book, like I said, were personal. I think that it's important enough just to have the conversation. Like, if you're, and I've said this often when talking about the book, if you're at a bar, whenever that's safe again, or if you're, talking with friends about, and watching a game, and a player comes on who has been accused of something, and that makes you uncomfortable, you should be able to talk about that. Like, I'm a Yankees fan, and the Aroldis Chapman stuff that the fan Tanya Bondurant we talked to about that, which that's all stuff that I felt. And every time Aroldis Chapman comes on the TV, I'm like, this sense of dread. It's an kind of moment. And what she said, the way that she got over it, because she can't just stop being a fan, was every time he recorded a strikeout, she donated $1 to an anti-domestic violence charity. And that was obviously a way for her to assuage her own guilt about still rooting for this team, but it was also a way for her to do something that she felt was tangible to counteract the effect of having someone like Aroldis Chapman still on your team. So yeah, I don't know if there's an easy answer for how we can, like, the thing about our book is that we're writing about systems, and individuals can't affect systemic change. But there are small things that we can do. And I think the conversation in itself is important enough.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Like, anytime you're talking about systemic problems, the individuals they can really only do so much. And so much of so the book was originally called How to Love Sports When They Don't Love You Back. And it got changed correctly by the people at the press to Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, because the how is really, really complicated when you're talking to individual people who are going up against very powerful, moneyed institutions and long-standing traditional sports structures, right? And so I think one thing, Kavitha and I have talked about this a lot, is like, you should do what makes you comfortable. You should be kind to yourself about this, like recognize that you're an individual within a giant system and you can only do so much. But I totally agree with Kavitha, like, figure out where your line is in the sand and draw it, and then do what makes you feel good for yourself, whether that's assuaging your guilt or doing something that's productive within your own community. I don't know, this is so hard. I don't think there's a good answer for how we get these giant systems to change. And Kavitha's right. Like, we haven't seen a ton of change in like who gets employed and who gets fired and for what reasons. I do think we've had a real big shift in like how we have a conversation about this. I think that fans have made it clear to sports media that they demand more and better conversations around gendered violence. And that has trickled into what institutions do and what they say, because they're going to have to say it in public, and they're going to have to answer for it in public. And so there's a way that I think has trickled up, and we got a long way to go, but it's very different now than when Ray Rice happened. And so I don't know, I tell people, like, if it's your university, write an email to the president. Like, certainly the people who are, as we saw with the University of Texas and their racist song that they sing, which I'm a student there right now, the people who really want that song to stay will write the president of the university to let them know that that song should still stay. And I think it's important that you do tell the people that you can, who have the power, that you are unhappy about it. They really, really do not like bad press. They do not like having a bad reputation, though they will make choices for all kinds of reasons, mainly money, that don't have anything to do with that.
Yeah. And while we haven't seen a ton of change in the sense of, player gets accused of this, public outcry, player gets cut from the team, we have seen, like, it's hard to imagine in 2021 the kind of scenes that we saw in 2014 of Ravens fans lining up in public for public support rallies for Ray Rice, right? And I kind of hate that Ray Rice is the example that we have to point to here, because he is the, like, probably the only or the biggest example of someone who actually did everything right after that, who showed attrition, who did the work. And the reason that he was not employed was because he was at the tail end of his career and he didn't really have very much more to give on the field. But everyone else that we can point to in this space, Greg Hardy's a really good example about someone who not only got a bunch of second chances, but had public support. But the thing that I do think has changed, like I said, is I don't think that if a player gets accused of something, we are going to see a mass culmination of fans of that team or of that player fighting for his right to stay on the team. I think that he will stay on the team, whether, based on his talent level, but there won't be this kind of shield of support from fans that we did see 6 and 7 years ago.
So that kind of leads me to a question that I have kind of further down, but it's a perfect segue there. Talking about the talent level, 2008 kind of sticks out to me, with James Harrison and Cedric Wilson for the Pittsburgh Steelers, both accused of domestic violence. One is a all-pro linebacker in James Harrison. Cedric Wilson, he's kind of a replacement level wide receiver. Harrison stayed on the field while Wilson was cut. Do you still think that performance, the performance of a player still kind of impacts them staying on the team? You can look at baseball. Domingo Germán just got recalled by the Yankees. Odubel Herrera, he was back with the Phillies, and there was a lot of conversation around spring training, but at the end of the day, his slash line wasn't good. He was hitting underneath the Mendoza line. But if he was hitting 275 in spring training, do you think that he would have made the team just because he's performing at that level?
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
I mean, I think that the very cynical side of me thinks, I don't even have to say I'm cynical. I think the evidence bears out that that is how these things work. I think money is the biggest factor in winning, and job security, all those things. I think one thing we can see with gendered violence, there's always an excuse that someone can make to excuse away actions that someone has done. The biggest one being, he said, she said, we don't know what happened. How can we judge, right? Like, we have very useful and familiar narratives that are super easy to tap into. You don't even have to like do any work. Everyone already understands what it is that you are talking about as soon as you say it. And so there is a way that you can always excuse away whatever you know about it. And one thing that you can count on is that most people won't know anything about the case. They won't actually have read the specifics. They're not, Kavitha and I, they're not reading police reports and reading what everyone's saying in interviews and what we can glean about what actually happened that day, what evidence really is there. And I think, yeah, if you're a good player, that is basically the best job security you can have. We have seen universities, we have seen teams, we have seen leagues bend over backwards to figure out the best way to keep these guys and to have it be a PR thing. That's why there's this whole, like, the redemption narrative is so seductive, and we love it for all kinds of things. We really love it in sports, and we really love it when people do something off the field, some kind of harmful behavior off the field, including gendered violence or domestic violence. And we are like, oh, then they scored a touchdown. That has redeemed them from whatever harm they have caused in other parts of their life. And people like that feeling. It makes them feel better about the fact that this very good player is still on their team, even though what you do on the field has nothing to do with accountability and healing off of it. But we like that. It's like the flip side of that he said, she said coin. Like, we know what we're talking about already within our culture. So yeah, I think it's absolutely, the better a player you are, the more likely you are to make it through this kind of bad PR.
Well, and one of the unintended consequences of the last 7 years, when every single league had to revamp its domestic violence policy, is that now we basically have a framework for minimum sentences and minimum punishments that then allow leagues to point to that and say, well, this guy did his time. You know, Odubel Herrera did his, 85 games, I want to say, which, yeah, I mean, that's half the season. There's also still like a really weird incentive that I think that under MLB's domestic violence policy, you're still eligible for postseason play, which doesn't make any sense to me. But it means that teams and leagues can basically say, listen, like, Domingo Germán did his time and now he's back. And the only reason he got sent down the first time was because he wasn't pitching well. And now he's been recalled to give him a second shot. So I definitely think that this still works as a meritocracy. And one of the reasons that I thought Aroldis Chapman was an important one to include in the book, aside from my own personal feelings about that, was, you know, he's a really good example of the fact that even when a team does cut you or wants to get rid of you, there will be someone who picks you up. The way that he landed on the Yankees was that he was on the Cincinnati Reds when he did this. And the Reds basically said, we don't want this guy anywhere near our team. And they tried to shop him around. And I believe the Dodgers and the Red Sox both said no because they knew what he had done. And the Yankees took him at an extremely cheap price. The stressed asset, exactly.
Yeah.
Because the Reds were desperate to get rid of him. And they traded him for that season, built his value. They traded him to the Cubs for a prospect that ended up becoming Gleyber Torres, which is a huge part of their team right now. And then they re-signed him as a free agent after he won a World Series with the Cubs. So just the movement that we saw there, the fact that there were teams that didn't want to sign him, that didn't want to trade for him, but there were still obviously teams that did, and they got him at a bargain in order to do so, because of this thing that he did really does not sit well with me, but kind of is indicative of where we are with the talent level thing.
You kind of touched on, sorry, my voice is just off today. You kind of touched on this already, but how would you respond to fans who want to give someone a second chance, but just not on the team?
I think they should really think about what they mean by second chance and how someone should earn it. I think we have this idea that second chances should just be given, and I think that's we've really got to, as a society, sit down and unpack that general belief. Like, what has this person done to earn this space again? Like, it's one thing I believe in second chances, and I think we need a whole different kind of system to respond to gendered violence, one that's much more rehabilitative and much more healing rather than punishment based, and much more centered on what victims actually need out of all of this. And I think so, again, I just want to go back. I think it's an easy narrative. I think when you say someone deserves a second chance, it's just so easy to be like, well, of course they do. How dare us punish anyone, hold someone accountable, make them earn that back? I mean, it's really, I don't have a good answer to this, because I do think that a second chance is something that should exist. Absolutely. I do think we just don't spend nearly enough time even considering what we mean by that. I think it's a crutch. I think it's a sort of a lazy answer. And so certainly it makes sense that you would be like, on that team, it's fine. My team, no, I feel uncomfortable. And the thing I would say to that is, these are communities of people. Like the thing I kept with Greg Hardy, I know we keep coming back to him, he's just such an easy case. When Dallas brought him in, it's like, what is this saying to the Dallas community about the safety of that community and who counts as a valued member of that community? And the Dallas Cowboys will, sell themselves constantly on being a part of that community. You go to their website and it's all the like outreach they've done in the community. But then this idea that they're giving, Jerry Jones was like, we're giving him a second chance. I've talked to him one time and I think it's fine. And people who want to win a game will think, okay, I feel okay about it because it's a second chance. But yeah, what does that mean for the community without any kind of actual action and repair and healing behind those moves?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, like I said before, Ray Rice throws a wrench into this conversation because I think he did deserve a second chance. And a ton of anti-domestic violence advocacy groups said the same thing, having met with him. So I do believe second chances are possible. And I do believe that they can be given. That said, I think because we're so easy to give them, I think what requires that to happen gets so watered down. Like, it can be something as easy as just showing, even if you're faking it, showing attrition at a press conference, and even that is not attainable for a lot of people. Chapman and Herman, and you can go down the line of people who just never apologized for anything, didn't take responsibility for what they've done, and then doing the actual work. Like, so where is the threshold? Where do we set the bar for who deserves a second chance? And I think because we assume everybody does, that means that nobody ends up meeting or clearing that bar.
Over the past few years, there have been 3 words that make my blood boil more than anything else. They really just get me, and that's stick to sports. We hear it in this climate. We hear it on Twitter all the time, as I know you both know that. You hear Laura Ingraham tell LeBron James, shut up and dribble. Why is sticking to sports just not an option now or ever?
It never has been. Like, it's just never been a thing. And I think that we're finally at a place where most people can say out loud that sticking to sports isn't a real thing. I do understand it. Like, the world is hard, especially in the last 4 years. Like, turning on the TV has been hard, but turning on Twitter has been hard. But and people, I think are justified for wanting something to escape everything that's going on in the world. And if sports can be that for you, then that's great. The reality is that sports can't be that for so many people. And I think that it's those of us who have not been able to escape the world through sports that now have more of a voice. And that includes players, and that includes people working within these industries who are saying, these things, first of all, priorities, like let's get our priorities in order. When the NBA players were set to re-enter the bubble last year, a real conversation that they had was, is this responsible given everything, all of the strides that we've made in fighting for and talking about racial and social justice? Is it responsible to go back to playing basketball, to give this distraction from these bigger conversations that we're taking a part of? Or the other side of that, which obviously is where they collectively landed, is returning to play and getting back on national television going to give us even more of a platform to talk about these things. And you did see that, for a while, players only talked about George Floyd when they had post-game press conferences. So, I think that we're finally at a point where, those of us who can't just watch a game and not think about Aroldis Chapman, or can't just watch a game and not think about, the fact that the University of Wisconsin's budget was cut by $500 million, and then the Bucks got $500 million to build a new arena. Those kinds of things are now things that we can say out loud, and that hasn't always been the case. Oh, I'm sorry, and that hasn't always been the case, but neither has actually sticking to sports. Just the history of sports just belies that. Black people playing baseball was a radical act in itself. Women playing any sport is still a radical act, right? The classic examples to point to are, Hitler obviously was trying to use the Olympics as a pro-Nazi, campaign. Jesse Owens winning a gold medal, had all kinds of racial and social implications. Muhammad Ali and John Carlos, and you can go down the line of ways that sports have never just been about sports. So yeah, that's always been a myth.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. The idea that stick to sports, as if that's not a political decision in and of itself, because sports is built, like the institution of sport, the systems around sports, like the IOC, FIFA, these professional leagues, universities, NCAA amateurism, all this stuff has been built to keep very specific people in power and moneyed, and to keep very specific groups out of it, right? Sports, as it's imagined today, is an incredibly exclusive space. That is why we have all these bills in front of state legislators right now trying to keep trans kids from playing sports. Like, sports is just an exclusive space as it is. And so this idea of like, just stick to sports, how many people, when they think of sports, think of themselves outside of that space all the time, that they understand that it was not built for them, that if they are going to participate, even as fans, they're going to have to elbow their way into that space and constantly have their credentials questioned, their love questioned. Like, that is such a normal experience for a lot of people. So there's only very specific people who could stick to sports and not feel any of that history and that weight. And the other thing I'll say about this is sports does not stick to sports. There is, how many times does sports media want us to know the backstory of players? They just want us to know it in a very specific way that makes a very specific fan base feel good about the sports that they are watching. How much money did the NFL pay to have, the military fly over their games, right? Politicians show up all the time at sporting events. Sporting events ask them to come. This was this is a whole thing here in Texas when the Rangers invited the governor to throw out, well, I don't know, did they actually invite him? He said he wasn't going to do it after the MLB moved their All-Star game, but then it wasn't clear whether or not he'd actually been asked to do it. This happens all the time. Like, sports itself is not sticking to sports. Like, as I said before, Jerry Jones, as the owner of the Cowboys, understands that, like, it's not enough to put a product on the field. This is about building an entire brand, about being part of a community, about going to the Congress and asking, or the state legislature, and asking for money and subsidies and all these things to help fund the very thing that people wish would just stay some kind of pure. Sports is not able to stick to sports in any real way. So it's just, as Kavitha said, it's been really clear over the last 4 years, last year in particular, that this is really a myth, but I just think that's really the way to look at it, is like sports can't even do it.
Yeah, and just like a very quick point of clarification, the NFL didn't pay for those flyovers. The Department of Defense was paying
That's
the
what it
NFL
was.
for
Thank
to be
you.
able to fly over games, which
That's
is
what I
even
meant.
crazier, right? Like that's just even more wild. But but I think that let's also just be perfectly honest. When people say keep your politics out of my sports, they mean keep progressive politics out of my sport. Like that only goes one way. And
Sports are conservative as we imagine them. That's why we
Right.
care about tradition, history. Everything has to stay the same. Like it is, and I mean it with a little c. It is just a
Mhm.
conservatively built space.
And to Jessica's point, like this has just never been the case, and it's just a matter of what we consider to be politics, right? Like the Red Stars didn't play the national anthem before before one of their games last week, and the Mavericks decided that they were going to stop doing that. I think in February, then they kind of reneged on that, but anyway,
Well, they're going to pass a bill here in Texas to
they're
make them do it.
them do that, right? Which is just wild. But so like one of our colleagues at the Athletics slacked me. He's British, and he was like, why is this even a thing? Like, why do you play the national anthem before your games? And I'm like, well, let me tell you, it actually dates back to World War I, and it was propaganda. And it was baseball, like trying to engender, the troops and that kind
Sell
of thing.
tickets. People
Exactly.
felt good. So they
About
yeah.
being an American. So yeah, like this idea, not only has this idea that sticking to sports has never been an option, but it's been built into the system since the very beginning. Like, and it's really just because of what politics, quote unquote, offend certain people, that they want to keep those two things separated. And it really only goes one way.
I have a little off the script question because it just popped in my head of I'm really interested in, like, we've talked about like what the fans can do, but like also like what can the team, like the athletes do, because you brought up kind of like looking at them as like a labor struggle. And I think this past year you really saw like the power of their label and like or labor and their willingness to go on strike. They never said that. They said like boycott games, but it's like they're withholding their labor as workers. So like that's a strike to make that change, to like put on demands. So I was just curious about your thoughts on like how just your sorry, it was a full complete thought, but like just your thoughts on that, like that comparison of the workers movement, like applying it to the athletic world.
Well, I mean, so first of all, because of the strength of unions, which is a good thing overall, that does mean that players who are accused of things have a lot of protection, and they should. That's fundamentally, principally what those unions are there for. That said, I think what individual players can do, like there is some of that actually. Like if you talk to women who cover the Yankees, people know which players stand in solidarity with Domingo Germán and which players might be a little bit skeptical, which players are maybe not the most happy about having to still play with him, right? That exists on every team with everybody who's been accused of something. So I think that, players, it's kind of similar to like breaking the blue wall of silence, like, because that really very much exists with players. And I don't think you can reasonably expect that to happen in a public way, because obviously, these are your teammates and you have to play with them. But in whatever backdoor conversations you can have, if whatever, and it's also going to vary, it's going to vary widely depending on how much power and leverage the player in question, the bystanders, the players, the teammates in question have. But there is definitely a conversation that can be had where it's not just a given that all players will always stand with their teammate when they've been accused of something.
Yeah, because some of these athletes have been victims of gendered violence, domestic violence themselves, right? We don't talk a lot about male victims of this stuff, but that certainly exists. And yeah, teammates, I know this is so interesting to think about because they are laborers, right? And they have to go to work too. They're working alongside these people that they may not like very much, who they definitely disagree with. And that's hard. And I think they're stuck in contracts. We have to understand that they are constrained, and a lot of the choices that they get to make. I think this is a really weird thing about so much of athletics, is how much people are stuck where they are. But yeah, I think it does matter when athletes speak up about these things. And I think there's like Kavitha and I can be out here all day talking about this stuff. And some people listen to us. I definitely know that. And we hear from them, and that's wonderful. It's going to matter a lot more anytime it's a man talking about it, and being willing to have these conversations with other men, and especially people that they hold up, put on a pedestal. Like, those opinions will always matter more. And so, of course, I'd like to see more of that. I mean, God, I'm blanking on his name. Who is the Detroit Lion? I have it's the only football jersey I own.
Oh.
God, I talk about him all the time. I love him because he's such an advocate.
I know.
This is going to bother me now. It's a jersey it's the only one I ever bought. And I put his picture up. He's great. Anyway, he wrote a great piece at the Players Tribune a few years ago talking about how it's men's job to fight back against sexual assault, that like, this is never going to be something that just...
DeAndre Levy.
Yes, thank you. DeAndre Levy. He's been so good vocally. And the thing about it too is that he also has gone into the community. Like, he helped raise a bunch of money in Detroit when the DA there in Wayne County was trying to pay to get rape kits processed. He made an effort in the local community to raise that money in order to make that process happen, which is ridiculous that that's how it has to happen. So I do think that there's lots of things that athletes can. Jason Witten up in Dallas, he's partnered with Futures Without Violence and put it in coaching boys into men, which is a great program that Futures Without Violence does, to put it into local high schools, to start teaching these boys from their coaches that these things are important. And so I think there's lots of ways that the athletes themselves can intervene in really useful ways in this conversation.
So what does like a healthier masculinity look like? Like, we've talked about toxic masculinity, but also a part of, our Engaging Men campaign is to engage men on like, what does actually like a healthier masculinity look like?
Yeah, you sent us this question ahead of time, and I was like, this is a really good question that I had not spent a lot of time thinking about. I think it's always easier to diagnose than to create. I think vulnerability and honesty go a really long way. I think so much of masculinity is like an armor that people are supposed to put on. There's a performance they're supposed to enact. And a lot of it is being insensitive and being hard and not admitting fault. I'm just trying to think of like, how do I imagine what football players are supposed to be like on the field? I feel like that's like toxic masculinity. And so what is the opposite of that? And I do think, again, like talking about like what athletes can do as allies in this, like it matters when you tell your story and you talk about how devastating this kind of masculinity can be for you. Like, men are harmed by it as much as women are. It can be an exhausting thing to maintain. You can find yourself making choices that you think are harmful or bad in order to maintain it. And I think a healthier masculinity is being able to talk about that and admit that. And I don't know, this is such a good question. And I think it's really the heart of it, but it is so much harder to think about like what people should do versus like critiquing how they are now, because so much masculinity is toxic.
Well, I mean, I do think that it all, like, there are various ways that this manifests, but it all kind of has in common the root of just not being able, like not being afraid to express vulnerability or ask for help or just redefining what you consider to be weakness. Like, I think that that's a huge thing that we see in sports, and that, emotional vulnerability is not actually weakness. And, I think that, if you talk to athletes right now, especially, I mean, how many NBA players in the bubble talked very openly and very candidly about the mental health struggles of that environment, right? And that was important. That's healthy masculinity right there, right? I think that like Jessica said, so many of the things that we talk about in feminism is really also supposed to help men, because this idea that women are weak and emotional and men are not is as damaging to men as men than it is to women. And men like to be vulnerable and and have healthy heteronormative relationships with each other and like that kind of thing. Like, it's just the way that they interact with. I think that the way that men interact with each other is probably the primary place that healthy masculinity can manifest before it bleeds into how men interact with women. And I think that a lot of that starts with conversations that y'all might need to just have among yourselves.
I do think also you saying that thing about weakness, Kavitha, makes me think that like so much of how we position masculinity is that it is not femininity, and that femininity is very much the evil thing that you should avoid. And I think somehow, I don't know, I'm just a journalist. Like, I don't know how we combat that, but we have to remove that kind of gendered element. It's just so damaging to all of us. Like, my son is 12, and years ago now, there's an artist who created these posters, and they've been hanging on his wall forever. And it's like 12 pictures of girls on one and 12 pictures of a boy on another. And it's like, girls are this and boys are this. And it's all the opposite, right? Like, girls fart. Girls, I can't even remember. That's the one, of course, I remember off the top of my head. Like, boys cry, right, is one of the things. Like, boys are sensitive. Like, it's very much working against this in order to, and it's in his room just so that, like, when he does feel like crying, at least he has an example, like, right there on the wall that this is fine. Boys do this all the time. But I do think sorry, my dog. I do think there's something there about the idea of weakness, and often it's painted as you're being a girl. And that's so terrible to girls, but also to these men. And we've got to figure out a better way to imagine a masculinity that doesn't do that kind of damaging gendered work.
Yeah, what Jill said reminded me of the, I believe it's Bell Hooks, who said, like, the first ask of patriarchy to men is not to do violence to women, but to do violence to themselves and cut themselves off from like their emotional awareness, really. But yeah, so what can we do or how can we, like, hold people accountable for their actions, and also, but look to have them, move forward in a positive way by joining the movement, or how can they join the movement?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think men recruiting other men is really the primary way to go about that, frankly. Like, I go back to something that Jessica said, which is basically these conversations. Men are going to be more willing to be vulnerable and to have honest conversations with other men than they are with women. Which is interesting, because I have found actually that in my work, this might be an aside, but like, there are definitely times when I think being a woman asking questions of male athletes is an advantage, that it's a disarming, and that I get more honest, probably more emotionally vulnerable answers than I would. But I also do think that if you're talking about joining a movement, that's probably easier to do with another dude than it is with a woman. So I think, recruitment. And then just, again, having, like, it goes such a long way to just call out problematic behavior when you see it, and just to say, hey, don't use pussy in that way, or don't talk about this in this certain way. And I think that goes a really long way.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo Kavitha here. I talked about coaching boys into men, the Futures Without Violence does, and part of why that, when I interviewed someone at Futures Without Violence about that program, they said it works really, really well when the coach has already bought into it, right? And when the coach does not buy into it, it does not work, right? So we have to get buy-in from people already within these systems. They have to care about this, and they have to care about it in a real way, and they have to want there to be change. And that's a big ask. I don't want to, like, say just do that. I mean, these are people who are brought up in the very system that we're sitting here critiquing. The fact that they can't see themselves outside of that context is not necessarily their fault, right? And so it's a huge ask. I was at I think it's a D2 school. I don't know. It's a small school in the Midwest once. And I was meeting like with the Title IX coordinator and the athletic director, and the football coach was there. And they were talking about all this great stuff around like what they wanted to do for preventative education around domestic violence and sexual assault with their athletes. And they're saying all this great stuff. And I just really appreciated the head football coach in this one moment when he said, this all sounds great, but you're going to have to teach me how to teach this. Like, I don't have the tools yet, right? Don't just send me into the locker room to talk to a bunch of dudes about sexual assault in a way that's healthy. Like, I can't just do that. And so I think part of it is figuring out how to get buy-in from the people that can actually do this kind of messaging, that can actually do this kind of teaching. That, I mean, I don't think Kavitha and I are going to be able to access those people in the ways that they really need to be. There has to be people within the system. And this is probably the hardest, most frustrating part. Like, how do we hold people accountable? We don't. Like, most of the time, we don't really get a say in who's held accountable. We can have feelings about it and voice those and hope that makes a change, but we need people who are already within the system who actually have that power and have that ability. And I don't even care if they change because it's in their hearts to hold people accountable. If it's because they don't want bad press, that's good enough for me. If it means that we can move, that there is going to be some kind of healing and accountability and moving forward. So it does, like, I know there on some level, I feel bad even saying all this out loud because it sounds like an abdication of my own responsibility in all of this and what individuals can do. But I think like it's, on some level, it does have to be men talking to men within these spaces. And yeah, maybe you're right, Kavitha, like when that there's something that men are willing to be more vulnerable with women because it's safer, because we won't mirror back a masculinity to them that will then judge them. And so maybe having a space where they can do that is really how we move forward here.
Yeah. And I will say that, just thinking about DeAndre Levy, it was Brenda Tracy who got him activated, basically. Like, so that's not always true that it's going to need to be men.
At the same time, Brenda's like a gang
Right.
rape survivor who has to tell her gang rape story over and over and over again. So like if we could
to locker rooms full of men. So
yeah, we could figure out a different path. That would be great. But you're totally right. There are absolutely women who can access this in a different way. It's just the price is so high.
Yeah.
And I know we're kind of cutting close on time here, so we just have a couple more questions for you.
We're talkers. We should have warned you.
I've listened to different interviews with you both on it. I was just looking forward to the conversation, so no worries at all. Well, one of my favorite chapters in your book is watching women's basketball whenever people make you feel like you're the only person who watches it. I love the WNBA. I just got my new Sabrina jersey in the mail the other day.
Oh, you got
I
it?
did
Good.
too.
Oh, good. Because now there's
nice
word that they're like, Shea Serrano was complaining that his is not on the way.
Yeah, he should order that Aces one, right? But not only do I just love the league, but I just love how front and center that they've been the past few years, just on every front, especially the players for the Atlanta Dream, seeing who the previous team owner was and just how vocal as a whole, the way that the WNBA is just kind of front and center. How pivotal were their voices, especially in the past few years, for change, both within the league as far as pay equity goes, but also culturally?
Big. I mean, on some level, there's a limit. There's only so far that women's sports can ever, at this point, have impact-wise compared to the NBA, right? Like, what would it be like if the NBA was collectively working in the same way that the WNBA does and has for a long time? But I think there's no way to tell the story of Georgia politics last year and the election of Raphael Warnock without talking about what the Atlanta Dream did and the way that the WNBA in general responded to Kelly Loeffler, the former owner of the team. I mean, It's spectacular. It's breathtaking. But even when you look at the larger issue of police violence and racism in this country, the WNBA was really leading the way. They were protesting this stuff before Colin Kaepernick was. They just don't quite, it'll be a long time until they have the same cultural impact. But I do think watching this collective action has been breathtaking. And we're seeing it in so, like you mentioned, pay equity. They negotiated probably the most progressive CBA we've ever seen in women's sports, and it's really exciting to see these players pushing as a collective group constantly, but with an ownership group that is willing to give them that space. I'm not going to ever like prop up owners in general, but you do see them working pretty well overall with these athletes to make a more equitable situation across the board in a space where they're denigrated. Like as Kavitha said, it's a radical act every time those women and non-binary people step on the court to play basketball, right? And I don't know, I just love them. I'm just so in awe of what the WNBA, the product is spectacular. Let's just say that. It is like supreme. They need more teams. There's something like, I think it was your colleague Kavitha, it was Chantal, that tweeted like there are going to be 9 roster spots maybe this year for new players. It's not like even the entire first round of the draft won't necessarily get jobs. It's too tight. It's so good. But also what they do with the little bit of space that they have, I wish that the men would follow better behind them and the way that they collectively act and the choices that they make for what is happening off the court.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about that CBA, I'm writing a piece right now on working moms in sports, and the WNBA has all kinds of provisions in their CBA to accommodate players with kids and coaches with kids and daycare and childcare facilities and breastfeeding facilities and all of that, which is not the case in other women's sports, and it's phenomenal. And yeah, just the way that, I mean, my colleague Chantal Jennings wrote this great piece about how not only has the WNBA just been at the forefront of activism, right? And talking about these things and bringing awareness to these things. And like Jessica said, knelt far before Colin Kaepernick did. I will also point out that Colin Kaepernick knelt far before anybody noticed he did. So there's also that. But excuse me, Chantal wrote this great piece about how the WNBA went from a league of activists to a league of organizers. And that's really where their power and their impact has been. And I don't think we can, I'm very careful not to overstate how much impact that has, because we wouldn't be here without Stacey Abrams and they wouldn't be here without Stacey Abrams.
Yeah, they'd be the first to say it too.
They would absolutely. And they worked so closely with her basically to say, listen, we're athletes. How do we do this? And then they did it. They very much did. And that's something that I think you are seeing trickle down to the NBA. I don't know if you're seeing it in other leagues, but definitely like these men are using these women as examples of how to properly organize. So yeah, I mean, it's absolutely been stunning to see. And also the fact that these women basically said within their own collective power, even when people for decades have told them they have none, that they will not play for an owner like this, that they will not accept her paychecks. They will not take the court as long as she still owns this team. I mean, that's kind of a stunning thing. We've only really seen owners being forced out of their ownership a handful of times. And it's when something like Jerry Richardson happens, right? Or Donald Sterling. And I don't think we've ever seen this happen in a women's team before. So yeah, it's been pretty stunning to witness.
And I do think it trickled down. I think what we saw around March Madness this year, with Sedona Prince putting out that TikTok, like maybe she would have done that without watching the women of the WNBA over the last 4 years. But I definitely think they've created this space to activate women that are coming up behind them. And it was funny to watch Leisha Clarendon, of all people, who's this amazing non-binary athlete in the WNBA, who's like really pushing on all kinds of stuff right now, the gender binary within the sport and all these great ways, like respond to these college players and say they're so inspirational. I never would have done that when I was in college. And it's like, yeah, that's true. We're in a different space now, but that's also because of what you are doing. In the W, like you're showing the people coming up behind you what they can do, as Kavitha said, like when they work collectively, and they use their voices. So it just makes me so optimistic about women's sport, which is not necessarily how I always feel, but I have felt really optimistic in the last couple of years, and the W is such a huge part of that.
Another reason to kind of be optimistic is a conversation we actually recently had with Pirates coach Don Kelly about the more recent hires of women in professional sports. You can look at Kim Ng, Bianca Smith, Becky Hammond, filling in for Pop whenever he got ejected, coaching her first game, and even Sarah Fuller, the kicker in college. Do you kind of see the culture changing, and do you think we'll continue to see the discrimination when it comes to acceptance for women in sports go away moving forward?
For sure. I mean, excuse me, we're seeing, in addition to Bianca and some of the names that you mentioned, I mean, I believe the San Francisco Giants have a woman third base coach maybe, and we're seeing women being hired in both front office and on-field positions in ways that we had never seen before. Usually when we had seen women in non-executive or business positions, it was always had medical trainer or something like that. And in the front office stuff, it was always something in marketing and PR. And now we're seeing actual baseball operations being run by a woman. And we're seeing women coaching men. Michelle Roberts might have been the catalyst for a lot of this, because she is now, running a labor union completely full of men. And yeah, so you see where this is going with coaches, referees, umpires. I think that our limitation is probably kicker in college, frankly. Like I think that we do still obviously have physical limitations here. But we don't have limitations when it comes to any of the other jobs that should be available. And I think more than anything, we've also just seen the resistance from, or presumed resistance. I don't know if we ever had actual resistance from players about being coached by women, but it was just assumed that that would be a thing. And, you talk to any guy who's been coached by Becky Hammond and they're like, I mean, she belongs here, right? And she's a great coach and they love playing for her. So and she will be the first woman head coach. It's just a matter of time for when Pop retires. But we are seeing those barriers fall very quickly, frankly. And to their credit, I've always thought that programs like this have been kind of lip service and kind of just for PR purposes. But these like internship and training programs that the NFL and the NBA and MLB have had have actually been wildly successful. This is, we can point to a couple of these coaches who came up in those programs. So yeah, it's extremely encouraging to see where that's going.
Yeah, it feels like people are dreaming big or imagining bigger. Like they just are expanding who they can even think of in these positions. And as soon as they do it, then it's like you can't go back from that, right? As soon as you hire a woman and it's fine and she's smart and she's good and players respond to her, like the thing about sports is that if you're good at it and you win, then the players will go along with you, right? I mean, there's all kinds of barriers here. Like we can talk about, NFL and their lack of Black head coaches. And like, there's definitely still barriers of discrimination, even when people finally get into those positions. But I would say like 10 years ago, we couldn't have even imagined, like people within sports wouldn't have even imagined it looking this way. Now we're here. And like, I just don't think that shrinks back. I think the imagination box is so much bigger. And I think you don't whoops into diversity, right? I say this all the time. Like no one's like, oh, accidentally, I hired a diverse force of people. You have to do that on purpose and you have to care. And we have I think it's Bruce Arians who's great about this in the NFL. Like he's really clear that he is like this, that this is important to him. We see this a lot with women's coaches, Tara Vanderveer, Muffet McGraw, who was at Notre Dame. Like they only hire women, and they're really upfront about that's a choice that they're making within this workforce. So I imagine the discrimination will continue. Becky will probably be the first, like Kavitha said. I expect that. She's gonna have to be great, right? And she definitely can, but there's all sorts of reasons that teams lose and things don't go right. And I think we'll all be holding our breath a little bit to see how that pans out and what that means for the next woman that comes behind her. But there would be a next one, even if it's hard. It feels impossible 5 years ago, and it will feel very hard after Becky, but it will be different, and that's thrilling.
I think that also, I mean, Jessica's absolutely right when she says 10 years ago, I don't think anybody could have imagined any of this, except for the fact that 10 years ago, everybody around baseball thought Kim Ng should be a GM. And then there was, I mean, I talked to Molly Knight about this. It got to the point where she kept getting overlooked and it kept not happening, that then nobody thought we would ever have a female GM. If Kim Ng couldn't do it, who would? Like, who could do that? And now that she's done that, and like I never really thought, I say this as a Yankee fan, I never really thought I would say this, but all the credit to Derek Jeter, man, like who like very much does, like, he was like, listen, I worked with her at the Yankees. I know what she can do. This is just should have happened 20 years ago. But yeah, I think that we had just seen since Kim Ng not getting hired to her getting hired, all of the other shifts happening, which is important too.